Let me introduce myself. I'm Leanne Howard, and I'm the Agile Practices Consultant for Planit Software Testing, and I will be your presenter for this session.
Welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us in this inaugural event. Just to note, this session is being recorded. Everyone is currently on mute, but I please encourage you to submit your questions via the question box throughout the session. Thank you for everyone that posted questions prior to this session, and we've had a large response on that. So I will try to cover as many as I possibly can within this 45-minute time box, plus any of the additional questions that come up if they're in the area that I'm talking about. For those of you where I don't get an opportunity to get to your question, I will reply personally post this session, and also I'm happy to have further in-depth discussions on particular areas. And you just need to contact me and I'll follow up with that, and I'll give my details at the end of the webinar. Also, some of the questions, whilst I'm going to cover them in a high level case for this webinar, because we're talking about Agile best practices overall, I will make sure that I note some of these areas for kind of deep dive sessions later on. So what I'm going to cover today in the webinar is the Agile best practices. I've broken that down into the Agile Manifesto, some of the challenges that we might experience, some of the benefits of doing Agile and Agile testing in particular, how we do Agile Test Planning, how we can use the testing quadrants to help us focus in on what we need to do as part of our tasks. I'll touch a little bit on test automation at a high level, and the lead-in for that is around regression testing, although test automation is not necessarily always looking at regression testing. And then just a little bit as a lead-in to our next webinar around the test of value in an Agile project. So the Agile Manifesto, it's amazing how many groups of people that I talk with when I'm doing reviews of projects that are not able to really talk in depth about what the Agile Manifesto is and what the 12 principles that are associated with the Agile Manifesto. So if you're working in an Agile project, this is the cornerstone, and you should be continually referring back to the manifesto. So let's quickly look at how each of these Agile Manifesto statements can impact your team. So the first, individuals and interactions over process and tools. Here we need to make sure that we get a lot of collaboration happening within our teams. And techniques such as the three amigos, where we have the developer, the tester, and the BA or the product owner involved in all of the conversations, is key. That means we're getting a good coverage of all of the various aspects. So from the business perspective, from the technical perspective, and from the quality perspective of what quality attributes we're expecting to be tested and be delivered as part of the customer value. Now, that's not to say, of course, that process isn't important and making sure that we use the right tools, but we need to make sure the process supports those individuals and the interactions rather than dictating how we work. And also we need to make sure that we're using the right tool set. So for example, if a whiteboard and some post-it notes are good enough for your team, then let's use that rather than using an electronic tool. Let's get the collaboration happening within our teams. So the second point, the working software over comprehensive documentation. Again, a common myth in Agile is that there's no documentation. Well, actually, we do need some documentation, but we need to make sure it's the right level. And some of the things that are key here is, are we a newly formed Agile team? Are we coming from a Waterfall background? So in those instances, we might need slightly more documentation. Or if we're a heavily compliant or a adverse project or product that we're delivering, or maybe we're working in a safety critical area. But the key is that working software, and we need to be driving towards producing working software on, in fact, a daily basis. And working software doesn't actually mean that it's just functioning correctly. What it actually means is it's functioning correctly, yes, but it's also fit for purpose. So we understand our customer need and what we are delivering in our product to create that customer value. That leads next on to the customer collaboration over contract negotiation. So we really need to be focusing in on what our customer is or who our customer is, and making sure we're delivering value specific to them. Ideally, if we can actually be talking to our end customer or get our end customer involved, rather than just having people involved that are our pseudo customer. Okay, so and not looking at our contract negotiation. So not saying, it doesn't say that in the contract, so we can't actually deliver that piece of functionality. We need to make sure that we're responding to change and that they are giving us the right information. And fourthly, responding to change over following a plan. So again, a myth in Agile is that we don't do any planning, and in fact I think we probably do more planning in Agile projects, and I'm going to come on to test planning specifically in a moment. But we need to make sure that we are responding to change. As we are learning more about our product, we are going to get other questions raised, we are going to get responses to our questions maybe, and we need to be able to factor that in. So we need to make sure that we're willing to make changes, albeit that we need to think about when those changes are happening. So if we are right near the end of the iteration, it may not be, we may not be able to make a change in that particular instance. So be flexible with your plan. So what are some real challenges for us as testers in an Agile project? One of the key things, and there's a lot of talk in the industry about this particular driver, the Agile mindset. It's thinking about things in a different way that allows us to collaborate and work more together. I've written a couple of articles around the Agile mindset. So what does it mean to have an Agile mindset, and how do we actually recruit to gain that Agile mindset, because it may be a slightly different recruitment process. So I've given you a couple of links there that you can go and have a look post the webinar and have a read. But the key things for me is things like a positive attitude, a thirst for knowledge. So we need to be asking those right questions. We need to be very focused on team success and making sure that we achieve those goals. We also need to be pragmatic. We, as testers, need to acknowledge that we are not necessarily going to be able to fit every single test into our iteration. And we need to have a willingness to fail, which relates to my third bullet point there. We need to experiment and fail fast. So that's not to say that we are continually failing. Obviously the key aspect there is learning from our failures. The second point, the faster delivery, that's a challenge for us as testers. How do we get all of the testing completed within that iteration? Or in some organizations much quicker, because they're delivering on a daily, even minute by minute basis. So again, there I think testing planning and involving the whole team is key, and I'll come on to that in a bit. The fourth challenge that I see for testers is doing the same thing, but it's about doing it better. It's about thinking how we can do things in a better way than we are currently doing that. And one of the things that I think is key to that is we as testers need to be very familiar with the testing techniques. We need to be able to decide what tests are best and identify those very quickly. And in order to do that, to ensure that we have the right coverage, we need to be using our testing techniques. So I've given some examples there of some systematic testing techniques and some structure-based techniques, which the systematic ones normally you'd be using at the system integration level, and possibly at the acceptance testing. The structure-based ones are more towards the unit testing. But everyone that is involved in testing in your project should be aware of what these techniques are, and we should be able to say, in order to cover that requirement, we need to create 10 tests, for example. There's a subsequent question to that that we also need to ask ourselves, and that's very much focused on risk. So testing is a risk mitigant activity. So we need to make sure that we as testers are focused in on the highest risk elements. And that's both from a product risk point of view, which we need to discuss with our product owners and our BAs, and also from a technical risk point of view, which would be part of our discussions with our developers. Then we need to make a decision to say 100% coverage, maybe 10 tests, but from a risk-based perspective, we might decide that for high risk we do all 10, for lower risk maybe we do 2 or 3. And we need to have that analysing happening before we even create any of our tests. So whilst in a traditional project testers should be using testing techniques, they actually become critical and very much a focus of best practice when we're moving into the Agile space. So what are some benefits of Agile testing compared to Waterfall techniques? And I've had quite a few questions in this area talking about the importance of testing in Agile projects and how do we gauge when Agile is more beneficial than maybe using some Waterfall techniques. Now, I've put a collection of things here because I couldn't cover all of the possible benefits of Agile. Some of these I think are related to benefits from you as an individual and what I think moving into the Agile testing can give you, and some I think are benefits from a project perspective. So autonomy as the first benefit. That gives testers a lot more scope for designing what it is that they need to do in their space. They're the test professionals and they should have the autonomy to make the decisions about what is best to test. Also collaboration. So for those people that like to have a collaborative approach, then that gives you a lot more freedom in an Agile team to be talking together. From a project perspective, some of you may have heard of the term about shift left. So that is more from an organizational perspective. It's talking about moving testing from the end of the project to throughout the project and doing testing continuously. That's not just test execution, but those other skills that testers bring, such as static reviews. So start right at the beginning. Make sure we are delivering quality user stories, use cases, whatever you're using as your methodology for capturing your requirements elaboration, make sure that those are testable, they're well defined, that they are small and discrete pieces of work. And this is a key area that where testers can add benefit. Working with the developers, so doing test-driven design, for example, where the testers and the developers talk about the tests they're going to execute for a requirement before even a piece of code is written. So again, we're building that quality in, so it's about quality first, making sure that we have quality right from the beginning and we're not relying on testing being performed at the end to find the defects. It also allows us to practice things such as exploratory testing. So how do we execute our tests, or plan and execute our tests, and then learn about the system as we go, which is then going to give us pointers about other areas that we can actually look in and explore. So making us focus on getting the right level of coverage for our testing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about session-based testing, which involves using the exploratory testing techniques in this webinar. From a personal perspective, it also allows us to really become quality coaches rather than being seen as the quality police, which is how some of us might be viewed on traditional projects. So we can actually help the team to recognize about building that quality in and about how we make sure we're delivering a quality product right from the beginning. And we are not seen as those people that are actually holding up the delivery of the product to live. I've had several questions also about specific areas of Scrum in particular, because that's the most widely and commonly used Agile framework, about how we add value as testers in some of those ceremonies and how we make sure that those ceremonies are of value. So I thought I'd just pick on the product grooming one as an example. So here the tester can add a lot of value. As I said, it's about building that quality in right from the beginning. It's about how we make sure that we all have a common understanding. We're all working towards a common goal. And part of that is making sure that the requirement is testable, because that means that is telling us when we both stop development and when we stop testing. So we as testers definitely need to be part of those grooming sessions, and we need to make sure that those are happening on a regular basis. And finally, in the benefits, again, back to the organization, it's about delivering value quicker and realizing those benefits. Now, again, a common myth here is Agile is going to deliver everything quicker, and that's not necessarily the case. It certainly is going to be delivering chunks of functionality quicker, and it's definitely going to allow us to realize some of our benefits quicker. But of course, it's unrealistic to think that we can deliver everything just in a quicker amount of time just because we're using an Agile methodology or framework. So it's about delivering small pieces as quickly as possible so that we can get that feedback. So Agile is a key driver in obtaining feedback quickly, and that's feedback from our end users, not feedback from within our team. So we want to get that quick feedback loop. That's not to say though we have feedback loops within our team. We absolutely do. So we as testers can provide quick feedback to our developers, quick feedback to our BAs, quick feedback to our product owners. So that's some of the benefits of Agile testing. both from a personal perspective that will allow you to grow your career in a different way, but also from the perspective of how we can deliver product to our customer and therefore benefit the organization that we work for. So it's about that shift left and focusing in on the cost of quality. Because we all know if we can find defects in the requirements, then that is much cheaper to fix than if we find requirement defects or code defects towards the end of the iteration or just before we're about to go live, or even worse, once we have gone live. So we need to make sure that we're continuously thinking about that. So I just want to highlight some things to consider in your iteration planning meetings. And I've had a huge number of questions in this particular area. So I just want to spend a little bit of time on the planning aspects. So testers need to be involved in the iteration planning. And when I say testers, I mean all the testers in the team. It's no point having just the test manager in the iteration planning or the test lead, and then they go back and have to report to their testers what has been discussed. Out of our iteration planning meeting, we need to be thinking about starting testing on day 2 of our iteration. And I work with a lot of teams that the developers spend the first week coding and the poor testers don't get a look at the code until week 2. That is going to hold up your testing and potentially hold up your delivery. So it's critical in iteration planning that you talk with your developers about how you can break things down into a much smaller level of detail, and that the developers are not driving the planning sessions, but it is team collaboration. So we all break the stories down into smaller chunks. We understand the acceptance criteria. We make sure that we understand what are the key tasks that we as a team need to undertake in order to fully deliver that user story. And we make sure that we're talking with the developers about not developing up to the last minute of the iteration. So if our iteration deliverable is completing on the Friday, let's say, we don't have new drops of code Friday afternoon, because that doesn't allow us to, as testers, to be able to test it with any degree of quality. So these are all the types of questions that we need to be having during our iteration planning. And we need to make sure that we set aside enough time to have these discussions so that we're not halfway through our iteration and we suddenly get surprises because we didn't have the right level of conversation during that planning stage. So talking about Agile planning specifically, this is one of the techniques that I use to help me as a tester facilitate conversations during our iteration planning. I've represented this as some bubbles, some key areas. However, when I'm doing this in an iteration planning meeting, I normally design a mind map to capture this information. So we start with our user story in the middle, with our acceptance criteria, and then the bubbles around the outside, the light blue bubbles, I would already have those as part of a template created. So these are the key areas that we're going to talk about for each user story. And I might have already made some notes, which you can see the notes against each of those bubbles before I go into the meeting. So those are my starting point for my planning. But then we need to make sure we facilitate the whole team being involved in this planning activity. So we have these discussions. I understand from the BA and the product owner what are the things of value, what are the things that they consider to be priority to the stories, and I also understand from a technical perspective how the developers are actually going to implement this story. And we have an agreed focus on each of the user stories and agreed understanding. So this is one of the reasons why I think planning in Agile is critical, and I think we do more planning. And if you get this planning right, then this is going to be one of your key success criteria for being able to deliver during your iteration or your sprint. Also, I've had several questions around your Agile test plan. If things keep changing, which I've already said part of the Agile Manifesto is responding to change, how do we keep our plan up to date? Well, this is a way that I think that you can do this. By creating a mind map, it's very easy to keep that updated. By having the conversations as part of the iteration planning, everyone has a common understanding. So you don't need to write a 30-page test plan. Maybe just some key bullet points to collect that understanding. And we would do this exercise in each of the iteration planning meetings. So we're collecting the information just in time. We're not writing a huge test plan up front, and that means again that the changes hopefully we've already catered for, because we already know what we're bringing into that particular iteration. So session-based testing, I think that this is one of the key areas for best practice in an Agile team that is going to aid you as testers being able to keep up with the amount of testing that you need to do within an iteration. So it is a software testing method that allows you to combine accountability and exploratory testing. So again, a common myth is that we don't document anything, therefore we're not accountable for anything. Well, using a session-based technique, we definitely do document things, but it's lightweight documentation. We can adapt it and we can change it as we go along and as we discover more information. So it's designing on the fly, albeit that we would have at least a minimum plan of what we're going to do in our session. We set aside a time box, so maybe half an hour, in which we are going to execute this particular session. And we should have an objective for this session that we are focusing on. We do our 30 minutes and then we review where we're up to. So we're even giving ourselves rapid feedback. So did we cover everything we needed to do during that session? Did we make sure that any new areas were documented? If we found new areas, so let's say we found a defect, and we all know where we find one defect, there's likely to be a cluster of other defects. So maybe we might want to make that our next charter. It also allows for management control and reporting of metrics on the back of that session. So that's a good technique that I would suggest you do for best practice in your Agile testing. Another key input for your test planning and also your testing throughout the iteration is to focus on the testing quadrants. And if you haven't read anything about the testing quadrants, I would suggest going and have a look at this, because this is almost like a checklist of things that you need to consider as part of your testing. And you might want to have this up as, say, a poster on the wall where you do your planning activities. I just want to highlight around one of the areas which is commonly not very well covered in Agile and also I think traditional projects, and that's around the ILITY testing, the quality attributes testing. So just because we're in an Agile project doesn't mean to say we can't do this testing as part of the iteration. And again, one of my colleagues in Planit has written a post about performance testing. So you can go and have a look at that, about some ideas about how we make sure that we are doing performance testing throughout the iterations and not just leaving it till the end. So make sure you're considering the non-functional attributes. Maybe you could create user stories for the non-functional attributes, or maybe you make some of these as your acceptance criteria. So we can, for example, if we're testing websites or mobile applications, we make sure that we are looking at the accessibility standards, for example, and these would probably be acceptance criteria for actually most of your user stories. So again, use this as a kind of checklist, as a memory jog, to make sure you're covering all of this testing, if it's appropriate, during your planning activities. Also, one of the key things in our planning is to be thinking about regression testing, and this is definitely an area where we have had a huge number of questions, and it's likely that I'm going to cover this in more depth as a particular webinar session. So regression testing. So Adrian, would you like to put the poll up, and we'll get some response from our audience. So I just want to understand what and how you do your regression testing in your Agile projects currently. So how do you handle testing within your Agile projects? Is it within the iteration? Are you doing it at the end of the iteration? Do you have a separate regression iteration just before go live? Or are you doing regression testing, say, once a week or on a periodic basis? So I'll just give you a couple more seconds to complete that poll. And okay, we're getting some great responses. Thank you. Oh, we're actually almost neck and neck for at the end of the iteration and as a separate regression iteration. Okay, so I think we'll cut that off and we'll have a look at those results. So the most popular response is a separate regression iteration just before go live, and in fact, working with a lot of teams, that's actually something that I would have expected. Second to that is the at the end of the iteration, and well, I think that's good. At least a quarter of you are attempting regression testing within the iteration. We really need to be thinking about regression testing up front when we're doing our planning, but also we need to be making sure that we're doing regression testing smartly. And as it happens, I've just written an article about that, which will be available in our insights area in the Planit website shortly. And here I talk about the fact that we're highly collaborative, so we're talking to our developers. So we should be able to understand what the impacts on our testing are from the changes that are being made in the code. And collaboratively, we need to make a decision about what do we need to do for regression testing. So here we might have a regression pack, but we should be able to pick out of that regression pack only those tests that we consider are appropriate to be run. We shouldn't be running big regression packs. And that's going to then allow us to be running that regression testing continuously throughout that iteration or throughout our sprint. And in fact, we all know that regression testing should be run after any change, so change in configuration, change in code, change in environment. So we need to be trying to think about how we can get smarter about our regression testing. We need to be making sure that we consider automation from a regression perspective. And I'm going to talk about automation just in a bit, but we need to start identifying those tests for regression packs and automating them straight away, even before we've run them in a manual way, so that we get them ready. We need to be talking with our developers about created automatic unit tests, so they're ready to as part of the build process. And we need to be actively managing our regression tests. So I do work with teams, and probably find 20% of their regression pack are either redundant or repeated tests. So make sure you're factoring in actively managing your regression, and you're not just adding to a library infinitum. So as I said, automation for me is critical in an agile team. Now, that's not only for regression testing. It's not a silver bullet, and we need to really, again, plan carefully what we are and aren't going to automate. So automation is a development process, which means we should have some standards, some guidelines about how we write our tests, create some frameworks, for example, and we also critically need to think about what the return on investment is. Not everything is or can be automated, and not everything is going to give you a return on investment. So in that case, don't automate it, just run the test cases manually. So as we create each automated script, we need to be thinking about, is there a return on investment for this particular script? So looking at the effort of both creating the script and maintaining the script, and also something that people tend to forget, analyzing the results of running the automation against the reward and the value that they are going to give us. So again, we have had a lot of questions in the area of automation. So it's likely that we'll do a specific webinar just based on that particular area. So also a part of being smart about our automation is looking at something like the test automation pyramid. So we should have a lot of automated unit tests, albeit that they may be smaller. We then should have some acceptance tests, which will include some system integration tests, and then leave our exploratory testing and our other testing to the edge cases, to the areas where we might want to do more complex scenarios. So really think about what is the value that your automation is going to give you and where to focus your effort. Certainly you need to be focusing some effort on unit testing and making sure you get those automated, so they then become part of the automation build. And then you also need to be thinking about, where am I automating? So the user interface is only the tip of the iceberg. That's what we can see, but there's lots of other things that you can think about automating. So your web services, your APIs, your application to application business logic. So again, sort of pull over the covers and have a look at areas that are really going to benefit from automation and focus in on those areas first. So as I've said, we need to make sure that we are delivering much quicker. So this slide is really saying we need to accelerate from idea to story to production. And we need to make sure those fast feedback loops are happening, which is our actionable intelligence. So we need to gather feedback, which are then going to action as potential new ideas and maybe other new stories. So this is where we need to be getting to optimize our agile delivery. So I just want to finish off with the value that a tester can bring. We can definitely bring a different mindset. we are the ones that are often raising things like the what-if scenarios, looking at the edge scenarios. We bring our testing professionalism, so those things like the testing techniques. We can also make sure that things are testable and do static reviews. We are often also the people that raise the questions around the non-functional attributes. So looking at those performance, load, accessibility, usability, raising those questions to make sure they are covered to give value to the customer. And we become much more of a quality coach than a testing police. And looking to shift that mentality. So let's get quality first rather than finding the defects at the end. Now, I've put a collection of skill sets that I think testers need to have, and I've actually put Agile now as core because I think that is a core competency that testers need. So I've given you some ideas there that you can have a look at and maybe look at some areas you might want to explore. And this leads me to the next virtual meetup group because we've had a lot of questions in this area. So we're going to be looking at growing your testing career. So please look out for the invites for that next webinar, which will be coming up shortly, and we'll notify you soon. So for those of you that submitted your questions, thank you very much. I have tried to answer as many as I can in this Agile Best Practices, but I know that I have missed some and I couldn't fit them within the time box, so apologies. But I will follow up for each of those questions. I'm also open to follow up to talk more in depth about some of your questions, and you can contact me via LinkedIn or Twitter, or send me an email if you'd like to have a further conversation. So I really would encourage you to start thinking about your questions for the next webinar and post them to the Ask the Expert. Start thinking about other questions in other areas. Maybe I've prompted you to think about some questions in other areas, because those questions where we get the high demand, we'll start creating webinars for those in the future. Also, a little reminder for everyone, the Planit Index is now open, so I would really encourage you to participate. It allows us to shape our industry, the industry that we're working in. It allows you to see how other organizations are working and what they are doing in the area of testing. We're also, for each participant that completes the survey, we'll be donating $20 to the charity, and we will be announcing seminars where we will share the results with you. Also, participants will get a copy of the report. So thank you for investing your time on this webinar, and hopefully we see you at future webinars.